All right, we are live. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Illinois Green Party series. I am your host, David Rych. We have a recurring and very special guest, Howie Hawkins. Howie, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Very cool. Thank you for coming back on the show. You were on once before. It's a great pleasure and honor to have you on the show. Howie is the most recent candidate, presidential candidate for the Green Party. Excuse me. Currently is now running for governor of New York for the Green Party. And so we have him here, and we're going to get caught up on what he's up to and get his perspective on what's going on with the Green Party across the nation because he's got that awesome bird's eye view. All right. So what's going on with your campaign?
Well, we had the Democrats in April 2020 when we'd gone into lockdown with COVID and the legislature was meeting remotely online. We had Governor Cuomo, who since resigned in disgrace, and the chair of the Democratic Party, a guy named Jay Jacobs, pushed through a ballot access exclusion law. And what that did was it doubled the frequency we have to qualify from every 4 years for governor to every 2 years for both presidential and then gubernatorial candidates. They more than tripled the vote we need to get to keep a ballot line. So it used to be 50,000 votes. Now it's 130,000 votes or 2%. It's always 2%. And in 2020, that was 173,000 votes. So about 3.5 times what we used to have to get. And so in the presidential election, none of the minor parties on the New York ballot that didn't cross-endorse Trump or Biden, because we have fusion in New York, so candidates can appear on the ballot line of more than one party. All of us that didn't, ran our own candidates or didn't run a candidate got wiped off the ballot. And so to get back on the ballot, it now takes 45,000 signatures in 42 days. The old standard was 15,000 in 42 days, which is difficult. I mean, the 15,000 was difficult because most states have no limit on when you can get your signatures, or if they do have a limit, it's months or even years, not 42 days. So 45,000, we attempted it, as did 7 other independent gubernatorial tickets. And the Republican candidate tried to create another ballot line. And all those petitions failed. None of us got 45,000 votes in those 42 days. Now, we submitted them because in the past, petitions with less than the required signatures have passed because nobody objected. But of course, the Democrats, in this case, the Nassau County Democrats, where Jay Jacobs, the state chair, is also chair, objected to our petition, said we didn't have enough signatures. And, that was correct. And so the Board of Elections ruled our petition as well as 8 others or 7 others off the ballot. So in New York this year, unless we win a case in court that's pending, we're going to have just the Democratic and Republican candidates on the ballot. Although because of fusion, the Democrat will also have the Working Families line, the Conservative will also have the Republican line, because those 2 fusion parties always cross-endorse one of the 2 major parties. So we got this farcical 2-candidate, 4-party system now in New York. Now, our lawsuit, which we filed after the law passed in 2020, has been working its way through the courts. We lost at the district court level. We're now before the 2nd U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, and they were taking their sweet time. So we made a motion to get injunctive relief to put us on the ballot this year because we expect to win our case, or to expedite the hearing for that case. And our injunctive release was denied, but they said, okay, we'll expedite the hearing. But that means when they get back for their next term in September, they'll schedule it at their earliest convenience. We don't know what that means, but it's likely they won't even hear the case until it's too late to put us on the ballot if we win our case. So now we're stuck with the write-in campaign. And our main message to progressives in the state is we're the only way to vote for a universal public health care system, for Green New Deal climate action programs, for a guaranteed minimum income to end poverty, for affordable housing measures, and so forth. the Democrat is a cautious corporate centrist, and the Republican is a far right Trumpy Republican. So progressives have no way to use their vote as their voice for what they want unless they write us in. So that's going to be our message, and we will get it out there as best we can. But it'll be tough because, you know, the corporate media is not going to really cover a write-in campaign. The best we can get is coverage of our ballot access denial. And we got a couple news stories about that. So we're going to have to rely on social media and just grassroots campaigning. And, you know, we'll use it to, you know, build up our locals and recruit more members and, you know, build support for these issues. The other thing we're going to work on is we do have a bill drafted for fair ballot access, basically going back to the pre-2020 standard. And it, you know, we've written it for them, and we've talked to a bunch of Democratic legislators. And I joke with them that, you know, we just want to go back to the Putin standard, because the nearest or the only comparable petition we can find in the world to what we have to do in New York, or what we used to have to do, 15,042 days, was 15,000 signatures in 45 days if you want to run as an independent for the State Duma, their Congress, from one of their 85 regions, which are like their states. So I say, we just want to get back to the Putin standard. And the legislators and their staff chuckle.
I'm sure.
And they say, yeah, you're right. This law now is unreasonable. But none of them want to introduce it while they're running for re-election and face the wrath of Jay Jacobs, the state party chair, and Kathy Hochul, the governor. So we're going to shop it around. Maybe we're going to propose a better bill where you would have multiple ways of getting on a ballot. Any statewide office, for example, a number of registered people, minimum number of registered people in the party, a party petition, which you don't have that option in New York. The only option is to get on for governor and then get a certain number of votes. Right. That's something we want to discuss with some legislators that I think are sympathetic, as well as amongst ourselves. But we want to get that done. So by the end of the fall, we got a bill that's ready to be introduced, because you can't, the session starts in January, and by that point they're off and running. And first they got to deal with the budget. And so if legislation isn't written by that time, it's not going to get in. So that's going to be a major project for us in the next 5 months too.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It sounds very complicated. It sounds far more complicated than elections should be. Real quick, you got a couple fans here. Ethan Winnett saying you're his hero and he loves you. And then let's see, Tired Allison says Howie's on with a green heart. And Ethan also said Dario was fake, and I knew it the day he showed up. What does that mean?
Well, that was one of my opponents, and I came to the same conclusion very quickly too. He was about himself, not the Green Party. He just joined the Green Party, and the first thing he wanted to do was run for president, which was kind of strange. But
excuse me.
You know, what my campaign was about was trying to help, you know, the Greens get better organized at the local level, because that's the legs for any statewide or national campaign. It's where we can elect people now. We have a good record when we run local campaigns. It's where you don't need a lot of money or media. You just need to get out there and talk to people, knock on doors, listen to people, find out who's supporting you, keep a list so you can get them out on election day, and then be active between elections on the issues of concern to your community. And when, you know, people see you out there and then you've had personal contact with them, I mean, a lot of people will vote for you, even if they don't agree with you on the policies, just because you show them the respect to show up and talk to them. And I've found, you know, in my local campaigns, that I get a lot of votes from those kind of folks. They say, you know, I don't know if I agree with everything the Green Party stands for, but Howie, you always show up and you're always out there. And so I can trust you. Whereas the others, you know, I mean, and this is a one-party city where the Democrats have all the offices. And so the way you get elected there is you work your way up through the Democratic committees till you get designated. And then you don't have to campaign in the general election because the Democrat's going to win anyway. The only people who really challenged them, I got as much as 48% in one local race. Greens, for a while there, were getting 30 and 40%. We, beating the Republicans as well. We were the second party. So, we can do well there. But, the Democrats, so we have one candidate who crossed the machine on some issues. And so they didn't designate him. He was a citywide counselor at large. So we talked to him and we liked what he was doing. And so we ran him. But he said, when he got ready to run, I don't know how to do this. I've never really run a campaign. I just got designated. He was a retired firefighter, and the machine, thought he was a good guy at first. So we really know how to run campaigns. So Greens can win these local campaigns. So for me, the presidential campaign was about winning ballot lines, because in about 40 of the states, the presidential vote affects whether you'll have a ballot line going forward. So it's easier to run candidates down ballot. About, supporting and, one thing, local Greens, it helps them to know they're part of a larger movement. So that's what the president's campaign was also about, as well as advancing policies that we support and the Democrats and Republicans don't, like the Green New Deal, the Economic Bill of Rights, peace policies. And if I were to run again, I'd add a fourth theme. Those are my three major themes. The fourth one would be a pro-democracy agenda for reasonable ballot access, ranked choice voting, and proportional representation in the legislative bodies through proportional ranked choice voting for multi-member districts. Until we change that exclusionary winner-take-all single-member district election system, we're going to be called the spoilers. And as the Republicans become more and more extreme right-wing, a lot of progressive-minded people are going to settle for the Democrats to stop the fascists.
Right.
And then we're stuck with, corporate neoliberal, domestic austerity, militarism, corporate welfare, and the people's needs are not taken care of, let alone the climate or stopping the nuclear arms race. So the policy agenda, of course, was part of it as well.
Okay, very interesting. Kerry Chet Campbell is here watching. He says, run as a Green Party candidate for local, state, federal office, vote Green Party. You got a congratulations on 48% here from Ethan. Okay, that's very interesting. Now I wanted to talk a bit about, and also real quick back on what we were just talking about. It seems to me that and I don't know, I'm not a political scientist or anything like that, but I mean, it seems to me that third parties running at local office level it might be a more advantageous, as you're describing, because you don't have to get petitions and ballot access stuff like that. You can just run. In fact, I've covered with my radio station show. I've covered local elections before, and most people don't even run under a specific party flag. But you can announce that you're a member of the Green Party, and you can also the practical benefit of it is the local governments are where things the rubber hits the road. Really, they affect our day-to-day lives more than like a federal level or a state level. You can start if let's say you want a mayor of a small town or something like that. You can start encouraging green industry and green companies to come in, solar panels, renewable energy people, organic farmers, local organic farmers, so on and so forth. And you can probably do that pretty well from a local level. So I think it would be advantageous, not just politically, but I mean just socially, politically, and economically for everybody. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, in our system, which is a federal system, municipalities have enormous powers compared to most countries.
Yeah.
I mean, they have, of course, taxation, laws, regulations, procurement, what you buy and who you buy it from.
Right.
There's money to invest in, the kind of industries you're talking about. It even has the power of eminent domain.
Yeah.
So if you want to go public power instead of being dependent on some giant investor-owned utility, you can do that. If a factory is closing and move into cheaper labor overseas, you could take it over and buy it for the workers and have them buy it back from the city as a co-op over time. There's enormous amount of things we can do at the local level. The only real Green New Deal for 100% clean energy by 2030 is in Ithaca, New York. And they have a serious plan. They're really trying to do it. And so, with the failure of, the Democrats to do anything, not even a Green New Deal, but to Build Back Better, which was very limited, the initiative has to come from, local government and then in some cases, hopefully the state governments. They've got to show the way. And so there's a lot we can do, but we're also limited as well. Federal government can run deficits. So if you need to make investments now, like in clean energy, you can go into debt to do that. Whereas local governments and state governments have to balance their budgets by, statute or the state constitution or the city charter. Right. So the financing is difficult. But there's, another area, progressive tax reform, looking at things like land value taxation, having a progressive income tax locally, which, some states do, or they have an income tax, but a lot of them don't. But then you can substitute that for the regressive sales tax, which is very regressive, or the property tax, which is often regressive, and it's unequally distributed. So there's a lot you can do there to improve finances, as well as there's a lot of corruption in local government. There are a lot of sweetheart deals between the local political establishment and the people that finance them tend to be connected to construction and developers. And
right.
And I've, campaigning in New York, I've been in, rural upstate New York, which is Republican. And I have Republicans come up to me and say, you got to help us. We got this corrupt clique running our town, and I don't know what I could do for them as an unelected, Green, but, they face that problem too.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, because a lot of people don't pay attention to local elections, so there's not there's not a demand for transparency, if you will. So like a lot of stuff are going on day to day behind closed doors, and nobody really knows about it. A lot more attention, I think, just practically speaking, a lot more attention should be given to local elections because, again, these are affecting you day to day lives far more so than the federal. I'm not saying that the other elections don't matter because they do. But I mean, a lot more matters on the local level than I think people realize. We treat the president like he's a monarch, like everybody's focused on this one dude in the federal office, and it's, constitutionally only has really 3 powers. So, I mean, I don't know. Anyway, I can go on and on. So like Garrett Spieth, Speith, hello, Garrett. He says, do you have any advice for running as a Green in a rural Republican area like downstate Illinois? And real quick, Ethan has said Garrett talked to the mayor of Galesburg. That's Dr. Peter Schwartzman, who's been on the show many times. He's a friend of mine. And also, real quick, I am moving to Galesburg at the end of this week. He and I are going to do some really cool stuff, and we're going to try to make Galesburg as green as possible. All right. So, do you have any advice for somebody who's running in a really Republican rural town as a Green Party member?
Well, talk to people one-on-one, do your canvassing. Don't do the flyby canvassing, except maybe in the last few weeks. You want to have real conversations with people and listen more than, don't preach, but listen. Because a lot of people, they want to get things off their chest. They want to tell you what the issues are. They're just so glad to have somebody that wants to be in government talk to them because for most people, the government, even a small town government, is pretty remote. And like I said before, that will at least, put you on their good side because you listened. And then a lot of Republicans are not ideologues. They're just hereditary Republicans. They came up in a Republican family. They became a Republican. And, they have a lot of the same concerns as anybody. Right now it's the high cost of living. And, a lot of them are concerned about climate change, even though, the leaders of the party say it's a hoax. But a lot of them, realize that. So, you can find those people by canvassing. And of course, Democrats tend to ignore those rural Republican districts. So a lot of the Democrats, you can get their votes because they won't have a candidate or a serious candidate. So those are some of the things. But the main thing is just the nuts and bolts of local campaigning, which is you got to canvass the voters. You got to knock on doors, make phone calls. You need to have a public profile. So when there are public hearings or if there are any demonstrations or, you can get attention, letters to the editor in local papers. To the extent this would be covered by local media, you should build relationships with local journalists. Help them do their job because they're overworked. They got to get these stories in on deadline. If you send them press releases that are written like a newspaper story, some of them are just going to cut and paste.
Yeah.
We just had that. The Yonkers Times took a news release we sent out about the Board of Election decision to reject our petition. And they just took our analysis and our quotes and just pasted it right into this larger article. If you're not happy with what a journalist writes, talk to them about it respectfully, try to explain your position. You don't want to make an enemy of them or be hostile. Just be professional if it's not a good relationship, but hopefully you can make it a good relationship. And then, you want them to think you're interesting and you're a subject that will make for interesting stories that they'll want to cover. When it comes to TV, you want to have visuals because that's what it's all about on TV. I mean, and I've had this experience, I'll do a news conference and we'll have a prop and then they'll interview me and I'll get a sound bite and I'll ask somebody who saw it, well, what'd you think about what I said? And the usual answer is, I don't remember exactly what you said, but you sounded like you meant it and it looked good. So that's the kind of impression you get on TV. So you got to keep those things in mind. But again, the most important thing is go door to door or phone call and, keep a list of those people who support you or might support you. You might go back and talk to them again. And, when you get to election day, hopefully you have enough voters on your list that want to vote for you that you're going to win.
All right. Very cool. Let's see here. Abdul Jones says, Green Party National Meeting, July 22nd through the 24th. Be there. Where is that at?
It's virtual.
It's all virtual? Okay.
Yeah. And so, yeah, you can register online and there'll be workshops and I'm on one with Richard Winger of Ballot Access News about ballot access, talking about, what happened to us in New York, what happened to the petition of the Green Party of North Carolina, where the majority on the North Carolina Board of Election voted to deny their ballot access because there's some questions raised about some of their signatures. None of the signatures that more than qualified them for the ballot. So they had enough signatures validated by the county boards of election, which they sent to the state board. But what the Democrats are doing behind the scenes is calling up people that signed the petition and sometimes misrepresenting themselves as being from the Green Party or from the Board of Election. And, their basic line is, well, if the Greens are on the ballot, they're going to steal votes from the Democrats and the Republicans will win. So, we've got videotape of a house call. We got text from text messages. We got a phone call recorded. You can all find this on Matthew Ho's campaign page or his Twitter feed. I got an article I'm sending to Counterpunch tomorrow that will have all this information in it. It's called the Democrats' Third-Party Massacres. And I'm talking about what they did in New York, what they just did in North Carolina. I go back to the unprecedented campaign against Ralph Nader's ballot access in 2004. And the guy leading this, his name is Mark Elias. And he used to be head of the political law practice of Perkins Coie, which is the most powerful Washington Democratic law firm. But now he's got his own group called the Elias Law Group. And, his clients include the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, Democratic Governors Association, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, a bunch of members of Congress. And he was the counsel for John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, and Kamala Harris's presidential campaigns. And he's like their top Democratic election lawyer. And he's got a lot of attention in the last couple of years for taking on Trump's, steal the vote, lawsuits claiming fraud and beat him on all 46 of those lawsuits. And he's also filed against some of these voter suppression and election subversion laws that the Republicans are passing in the states. But he's got a dark side too. He spent decades trying to keep the Greens and other independent left candidates like Ralph Nader off the ballot by means like intimidating and hectoring and badgering people to remove their signatures from petitions. That's why the Democrats on the board of the state board of elections were able to say, well, there's a cloud over these signatures, so we can't, quote unquote, in good conscience, vote to affirm the petition, even though none of the signatures that were validated were being questioned. And the Greens election lawyer, Oliver Hall, who goes back to defending Nader's petitions and ballot access in 2004, asked the Democratic chair of this Board of Elections if any of the validated signatures were under question. And the chair said, I'm not going into the details of a criminal investigation. That's the first we knew it was a criminal investigation, if it really is. And so Oliver Hall said, well, you didn't answer my question. Are any of these signatures being questioned? And the chair of the meeting said, you're out of order. Mute his microphone. We had the same experience when we were trying to get on a ballot in Wisconsin. Our campaign manager, Andrea Merida, was representing us. And the Democratic chair, they call it the Wisconsin Election Commission there, said the Greens can't present new evidence. And the question there was, my running mate, Angela Walker, had moved across town in Florence, South Carolina. And so the correct address on her early petitions was different than the one on her later petitions. And that was the basis for the Democratic objection. So we could document that, she was accurate in her addresses. That's what the staff of the Elections Commission told us to do. But the Democratic chair of the meeting wouldn't let us document that. They wouldn't even let Angela come on herself and give, firsthand testimony as to where she lived when. And so they voted us down. And so Andrea, she asked to speak and was repeatedly told no, and finally told, if you speak again, we're going to cut you out of the meeting. And, we've had this, like Nader countersued. There was, scores of suits against his ballot access. He countersued the Democratic National Committee and a bunch of states. And they delayed, dealing with the case, and finally told them the statute of limitations ran out.
Oh, geez.
So that's the kind of, it's kind of a mix of Catch-22, Kafka, and The Godfather. You get this sort of passive-aggressive bureaucratic nonsense, and then you get this intimidation. I mean, some of Nader's petitioners were told by lawyers or sometimes private investigators who went to their homes, if anything's wrong on your petition, if there's any information that's not correct, you could be charged with a felony. It's intimidation.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
So that's what we got to run this gauntlet just to get on the ballot in this country. It's as Richard Winger at Ballot Access News said about the attack on Nader, you'd never see this in any other advanced democracy. They would consider it, and he called it unspeakably unethical.
Yeah, oh yeah, for sure. No, it's blatantly unethical, and why more is not being done about it, I don't know. Real quick, let's see. Okay, so Albert Schall is asking, in Illinois, write-in candidates have to file in each county for the votes to count, 102 in Illinois. Is there a similar standard in New York?
No, in New York, they count them. It's just they don't report them for weeks and weeks. But you eventually get the number. They're supposed to count them, and every county election board comes out with a list of all the write-in votes. So in New York, we don't have that problem. Okay. When we're running for president, we ended up on 30 ballots. So in 20 of the states, we want to do write-in, but some states just don't count write-ins. In Alabama, they told us you'd have to give us $1 million to go back and count. So we didn't pay that. No. And then there was in Pennsylvania, the state doesn't report, but county boards do. So you got to tally up the county boards. And by the time they were finished, it was too late for the official tally kept by the Federal Election Commission. So we have, several hundred, maybe 1,000 votes in Pennsylvania that aren't in our official tally at the Federal Election Commission. So every state has its own election laws. So you got 51 jurisdictions to deal with, counting the District of Columbia. It's insane. I mean, one of the things Greens should be campaigning for when we run for Congress is we should pass a federal standard for federal elections for ballot access. Mm-hmm. And you would think with, 100 or so progressives and, half a dozen members of the squad, somebody would have put in a fair ballot access bill. But the last decent bill was introduced by John Conyers in 1989. It's just not on their radar. I don't care if you're a Democratic Socialist, so-called, or just a run-of-the-mill machine Democrat. Ballot access doesn't concern them because they're on the ballot. Right. And to the extent it concerns them, they don't want the competition from the Green Party.
Well, I think that's a big part of it, is that they keep us off because we're a threat. Even if it just takes them down a little bit below their opponents' tally. Okay, so Garrett is asking if you thought about running for president again in 2024.
I've been saying I'm not going to look at that till after the midterms.
Okay.
I'm focused on following up on what we did in 2020 here in New York, this gubernatorial campaign, urging the Greens to work on these election reforms, fair ballot access, ranked choice voting, proportional representation. I think we got to move that up to the top of our list, because if I learned anything from the 2020 election, it's that with the Trump and extremist Republicans like him, we're going to have a hell of a time running in 2024 or any year in the future, because as I said before, progressive-minded people, moderates are just going to say, we got to vote for the Democrats to stop these fascist Republicans, which makes it, very difficult for us, not only to get on a ballot and get a hearing, but, people think we're quote unquote spoiling the election. The fact is we bring out more voters. That's why party suppression is a form of voter suppression. We know from exit polls in 2016 that 61% of Jill Stein's voters and 55% of the Libertarian candidate, Gary Johnson's voters, would have stayed home if they were not on the ballot.
Oh, wow.
So if you suppress these third parties, you're suppressing their voters. And, sure, there's people that swing between the Greens and the Democrats, mostly depending on the circumstances. If it's an easy win for the Democrats or the Republicans, a lot of people will say, I'm going to vote for the Greens to send them a message. Whereas if it's close, they're going to switch back to the Democrats to stop the Republicans. We take some votes from the Democrats. Of course, we want to. We want to take votes enough to win. But, an election system should let people vote for who they want without having to worry about it helping their worst enemy. And that's why we need ranked choice voting, and especially proportional ranked choice voting for legislative bodies, where you have multi-seat districts and you rank your choices among those multiple candidates, and then each party gets representation in proportion to the votes their candidates receive. Right. Right now, that 48% that somebody mentioned, and that I got, 48% of my district voted for me, and we got no representation.
Wow.
And that's true every election. Usually they're not that close, but and it's not just, Greens who don't get represented. If you're a Democrat in a Republican district or a Republican in a Democratic district, you don't get a representative of your choice. And most of our districts are non-competitive. The political scientists tell us 95% of state assembly or state legislative districts are uncompetitive. They're one-party districts. And right now, Cook Political Report has more than 92% of congressional districts this year predicted to be uncompetitive. In other words, the spread will be more than 5%. So it's pretty sure who's going to win. And usually the spread is much greater. I mean, a lot of those races are 60-40, 70-30, 80-20. And that's due to gerrymandering, which proportional representation would eliminate. You can't draw lines in a partisan bias because every party is going to get its proportional share of representation.
Yeah, no, that just happened here in Illinois when the Democrats run it, but it's extremely controversial, for sure. To say, yeah. All right, let's talk about some of the issues then, real quick. What's going on at the federal level? With like the Green New Deal or any sort of like legislation concerning? Obviously, the Supreme Court just put some sort of kibosh on the EPA's ability to regulate. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, it's probably not as bad as you first think. I mean, it overruled something I think originally from the Obama. Obama had a plan to regulate carbon emissions from coal plants,
right?
And the justices said, well, the EPA statute doesn't doesn't name carbon as a pollutant, so you can't regulate that. But I mean, the Clean Air Act, it's about clean air, and carbon is about clean air, and of course climate. So there are probably ways around it, and we need to work on that. And Congress can fix that with legislation. But that's the problem with all these climate activities. I mean, first of all, there was no Green New Deal from the Democratic Party. Let's be clear about that. That was from the Green Party.
Right.
And the slogan was taken by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And, she sat in with the Sunrise Movement. And Pelosi killed their plan to have a select committee that could put proposals on the floor. So they came up with a non-binding resolution, which watered down the Green Party's Green New Deal, eliminated the ban on fracking and new fossil fuel infrastructure, eliminated the phase out of nuclear power, eliminated the deep cuts in military spending to help pay for this Green New Deal, and it extended the deadline 20 years to 2050 for zero emissions, but they didn't really say zero emissions, not real zero emissions, net zero emissions.
Net zero, right.
Which is the way the fossil fuel industry loves that. Because they say, yeah, we can have net zero, we can burn fossil fuels and then capture the carbon and bury it underground. And they're actually starting to build infrastructure for that. There are these huge carbon pipelines going through states like Iowa that are proposed to take carbon from power plants, maybe factories that are using fossil fuels, and ship it out to be buried somewhere in the plains. And it's a huge infrastructure. It's very expensive. It's not going to work, especially with wind and solar. The costs are just dropping off a cliff. It's much cheaper than to burn fossil fuels. And once you have your clean energy infrastructure and your solar panels, your wind generators, your heat pumps, you don't have to buy fuel. So energy costs will come down with green energy. So, but none of that is happening in Congress. Build Back Better was pathetic in terms of reaching the goals that, Biden, he just pulled it out of his ass that he was going to get 50% cut in, I guess it was power emissions by 2030. You look at the actual plan, there's no way that plan would get that result. It was just, public, PR, propaganda. So there are some good bills that, AOC and Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush have introduced, a Green New Deal for public housing. Sanders has a comparable bill in the Senate. There's another one for a Green New Deal for public schools. Jamal Bowman's heading that one up. And there's a Green New Deal for cities. I think Cori Bush is heading that up. And they have good elements, but they're not the kind of Green New Deal we've been talking about, which is an eco-socialist Green New Deal where we do like we did during World War II, when the federal government took over a quarter of manufacturing in order to turn industry on a dime into what FDR called the arsenal of democracy, to arm the allies to defeat the fascists. We need to do less through the public sector with planning and ownership and direction from the public sector to coordinate all the things that need to be done to make a rapid transition to 100% clean energy and real zero carbon emissions, and hopefully going negative carbon emissions, because there's too much carbon in the atmosphere right now, and we got to draw it down. That is not happening. And I think there's no prospect of it happening with this Congress. And even if the Democrats, hold on to the House and get a few more votes in the Senate, they don't have the will to do that. They've already made that clear. There's been a lot of deference to the fossil fuel industry. Now there are new subsidies they want to give to the nuclear industry, and there's not much for the clean industry, and particularly the things we need to do to clean up the building sector, the transportation sector, the manufacturing sector, as well as the power sector, which most people talk about, not to mention the agricultural sector. So there's no prospect of that coming. We got to build a movement to make those demands more prominent, put the people that are in Congress on the hot seat, but we need to demonstrate how to do it. I mentioned Ithaca, New York. We need more cities doing that. I think Galesburg in Illinois is a smaller town where I know that Mayor Schwartzman wants to do that.
Yes.
And so we need to multiply those examples and hopefully get a lot of momentum. So it's like an avalanche, a snowball rolling downhill, and it keeps picking up momentum. That's, I think, our best hope.
Okay, very cool. Well, let's talk about nuclear energy real quick, since we're talking about climate change and so on and Green New Deals. I think that it's the most likely scenario that's going to occur is that because governments are buying into it, is that nuclear power plants are going to be built to, if you will, quote unquote, solve the energy crisis. It's a big sell for them because it's zero emissions, that kind of thing. But we all know the danger of fission diffusion. We haven't gotten to the point where we can actually use fusion. There's some arguments out there that fusion, if we could actually do that way, that it's not only zero emissions, but it's harmless. Like if something happens to the reactor, the fusion, that the process shuts down, there's no radioactive released. I don't know how much of that is true. This is merely hearsay as far as I know. But we're still at the point of fission, and I don't know anybody who thinks that fission is a good idea besides the governments. It's still very dangerous. Can you speak to the whole thing? Because that's probably the way the government. Biden loves nuclear power plants. That's probably the way it's going to go, unfortunately.
Yeah, the infrastructure bill they did pass and the Build Back Better bill they didn't pass had subsidies for nuclear power. Look, they're not going to build more nukes. Certainly not in the time scale that we're talking about. Nukes are not carbon free. There's a whole, supply chain, starting with, mining the uranium that emits carbon. And then, when they're down or they need backup, they use diesel generators. So they're not totally carbon free. They're lower carbon than, fossil fuel power plants, admittedly, but solar and wind are much lower carbon. Look, the nuclear industry is it's the biggest failure of an industry in the modern industrial era. They've never been able to pay for themselves. The insurance industry has never been willing to insure them. So the federal government does through the Price-Anderson Act, but we're not completely insured. There's just a limit to how much they'll pay in the case of a catastrophic accident, which is always a possibility that's growing as these nukes get older and the radiation embrittles parts. And, we're lucky at this point, we haven't had another serious, Chernobyl or Fukushima or 3 Mile Island kind of accident. We've come close many times. We still don't have a place for the waste, which lasts hundreds of thousands a year and is highly deadly. And then, it's just a diversion. The Obama administration provided loan guarantees. And so, down south, Duke Energy and the Southern Company and Georgia Power decided they would, use those loan guarantees to build nukes in South Carolina and Georgia. Well, the nukes in South Carolina spent billions and then shut them down because the overruns were too high and the construction delays were too much. And they're having the same thing in Georgia at the Vogtle site where there are already 2 nukes. They're building 2 more. And the costs are now double the original projections. And they still aren't online. They are, maybe a decade behind maybe it's now 6 years behind when they're supposed to open. And so they're bleeding the ratepayers of Georgia dry to subsidize this boondoggle. And, then there's the question of, do we keep the nukes we have open? And I would argue that as we phase out power plants, as we phase in clean renewables, I would say phase out the fossil fuel plants before the nuclear plants. But we're talking about a 10-year timeline, so the nukes don't have that much longer to run anyway. But those that are still running, like in New York, $8 billion subsidies, Exelon, based there in Illinois, wanted to shut them down. And Governor Cuomo got the ratepayers to subsidize them for, I forget how many years, but to the tune of $8 billion because it was quote unquote carbon free. I know that Exelon wants to shut down 2 nukes in Illinois now. And there's a proposal before Illinois to subsidize them so they'll keep them open. They got a bill passed in Ohio through bribery, and they got caught. And the law was repealed, but now they're going through another law, which not only subsidized the nukes, it subsidized a couple of coal plants in Indiana to provide power to Ohio. I mean, this is so corrupt. And the nuclear industry is, you can go around the world and see all the problems they've had. The French nuclear industry is, said to be the model, but with global warming, they can't keep the nukes open in summer because the water won't cool them. They're having a lot of problems with those nukes are getting older and, keeping them open and running. And to build a whole new set of nukes will be, hundreds of billions of dollars. So, that industry, those nukes are really designed only to last 30, 40 years. And most of them have,
really?
are up against their limit.
Oh, wow.
Unfortunately, our Nuclear Regulatory Commission keeps adding 20 years. Some of these nukes are permitted up to 80 years, and some are said to be proposing they get additional permits for 100 years. It's like, I'm trying to run a Model T that hasn't been well kept, down the interstate. It's going to blow up at some point. Right. So, nuclear is a dead end, a diversion of resources, and dangerous.
Yes. Okay. We got about 7 minutes left. Let's talk a bit more just about climate change in general. The IPCC says we have about 7.5 years to reduce emissions globally by about 45%, to mark the first marker, and then we go to the 2050, like you said, and that's a net zero goal. Now, right, wrong, or indifferent, do you think that we're on track to accomplish that in the next 7.5 years globally?
No, we're going the other direction.
Okay.
And we kind of flatlined during the COVID lockdown, and now we bounced back the last 2 years. And China especially, China's now emitting a third of all the carbon in the world. Oh. And they really jumped up. The US and Europe are next biggest. Latin America and Africa combined are about 4% of emissions. So they're not the problem. Although, Southeast Asia and South Asia are growing rapidly because that's where industry has moved. So that brings a lot of emissions from factories, from transportation. And, so what we really need is a global Green New Deal with climate reparations. So the wealthy countries that have emitted the most carbon historically, the United States and Europe, should be sending money to mitigate the damages climate change is already doing, and to help these countries leap out of the 19th century fossil fuel era into the 21st century solar era by building renewable energy instead of, coal plants, and which they're doing in India and Africa, and as well as gas plants. So that's really what we need. And, there is a green investment fund, I think it's called, that was set up about 10 years ago by one of those Conference of the Parties, COPs. And it was supposed to have $100 billion a year by 2020. It's had a total of something like $8 billion in the decade since it was started. The rich countries aren't investing what they committed themselves to. And Biden said he'd put more money in, but that hasn't happened. we're going in the wrong direction. We were just really setting ourselves up for a catastrophe. So, I think, so what can we do? I think we can do what we can where we can at local level and then state level. And hopefully that translates soon, rapidly to the national level. And, by demonstrating what a Green New Deal can do for an economy, I mean, those economies are going to be booming and their costs of energy are going to go down. It's going to be a whole new technological complex. And under capitalism, we have over capacity of the industries we do have. That leads to stagnation, the investment of capital in financial schemes, which can create bubbles that then collapse, like we saw with the housing bubble in 2008. We just saw with Bitcoin, that can, wreck economies. We're not investing in real assets. We're investing in fictional, assets that reference real assets, but get blown into these big bubbles. A Green New Deal would build real assets, and it would replace old assets, which are heating up the planet and poisoning us. So, how can you be against it? I think most people in the world are for it. It's just the vested interest. These big industries, they want to keep making money the way they've been making money. And that's who, in the end, we got to defeat, those big industrial corporations that are built around the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah. And that's a very, very much an upward hill to climb, because that's just, I don't know, they're huge and they're powerful. They have all the money and access to the resources. There's also the petrodollar problem too. Most of the oil in the world is sold using the American dollar, and you stop doing that, and the American dollar loses a great amount of its value globally. And I don't think that any president or anybody in the federal government is going to want to see that happen anytime soon. So I don't know. I'm going to keep fighting for it, but it just looks grim to me. So any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of predictions that the dollar is going to collapse and another reserve currency is going to rise in its place. I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're going to have a few reserve currencies. I mean, the way things are developing is you're going to have a one block around China, particularly with Russia and other countries in that geopolitical bloc, doing a lot more of their international transactions in their own currency. And then the dollar will still be a major currency in international trade. And I think, that's not a situation that's good, because, what we really need is for these two blocs to talk to each other seriously, despite their differences on, maybe human rights and democracy, about climate change, about arms control, about dealing with the COVID pandemic, which is, everybody just wants to wish it away, but COVID ain't going away. I mean, we got now a new wave, BA5, and 2.75, BA 2.75 is coming out of India, even more contagious. And people are getting, and then our vaccines were designed for earlier variants. So they've got to be updated. But the question is, can we update them in time? Meanwhile, nobody's wearing masks, in public places. And, so it's spreading. I hadn't ridden on a plane since the campaign. I had to drive my sister down to South Carolina and then in her car, and then flew back. It's like two of us on the plane were wearing masks. It's and the advice from public health officials is to do it. Right. They just won't mandate it anymore. Right. And that seems to be an accommodation by this Democratic administration to take away the criticism of the Republicans who were saying, "Oh, you're taking away our freedom." It didn't used to be a problem to issue public health guidances, which people would follow, or to take vaccines like childhood vaccines before you go to public school. Now that's all in question, and some of those diseases are coming back. Polio. What happens if smallpox reappears? And other things that measles takes its toll. So it just seems to be part of this right-wing anti-science attitude that says COVID is a hoax, climate change is a hoax, evolution didn't happen, and so forth. And it's not a smart way to deal with the real world.
Yeah, no, it's not. All right, well, we were at the end of this. So these shows fly by. There's so much more to talk about, but okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Howie Hawkins, Green Party candidate for governor of New York right now. Best wishes, best luck to you and everything you do. Thank you for all that you do, because you're a very important figure in the world. And we will all support you. And we look forward to seeing what happens with you next. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to the Illinois Green Party series. I'm your host, David Rych. Till next time, be good, be green. Take care, everybody.